Come one, come all, step right up and hear about beautiful slide tables, miraculous hair hangs, and a conversation with Circus chaplain Father Frank Cancro as we discuss the art of circus here on Created Things. Come one, come all, step right up, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, and welcome to Created Things, the only arts podcast where our clowning is very, very serious, but our topics are silly. I am artist and psychotherapist, as well as your host, Jacob Flores Popcheck. With me, as always, is my co-host, or should I say co-ring master of this program, medievalist, Catholic priest, Father Gabriel Toretta. How are you, my friend?
I'm doing real good. You know that, as most things in life, reminds me about a joke that the Austrians tell about the Germans, which is that
most things in life remind you of jokes that Austrians tell about Germans.
You're the one who said it. I mean, technically I said it first, but then you said it, so that means I can still say that. Anyways, the point is, there's this thing. They tell it on each other, and so they say, like, you ask a German something. There's something very problematic, and you ask a German, like, what's the situation? And he says, it's serious, but it's not hopeless. And you ask an Austrian, what's the situation like? What's it going to be? And he says, it's hopeless, but it's not serious. And I love this. This is really actually profoundly evocative of these two different cultures. So I actually love everything about it. Anyway, that's neither here nor there, but I was thinking about it. Those of us who are joining us in the multi-sensory 4D experience that is Spotify or the YouTubes might have noticed that while I am wearing the everyday fantastic clothing that God and the Dominican Order gave me, you are wearing unusually everyday fantastic clothes that I feel like require some amount of explanation.
Yeah, so again, check out the video version to see my duds, but I normally, my normal go-to are the black and white, or as one of my art mentors said, pastel black, that is gray, of the graphic designer. And then I might sometimes spice it up with a Hawaiian shirt. But today I am wearing a vintage circus vest that I do own, and I do wear to actual circuses.
Thanks for confirming that you didn't steal it for this show. I appreciate that.
I didn't steal it. Well, I didn't say I didn't steal it. I just say I own it. I could have stolen it. I could have stolen it from a clown or a ringmaster of sorts, or, well, I was going to say a strongman.
So you couldn't, look at the size of my arms. Take a clown. Don't kid yourself. Yeah, come on.
Yeah. But yes, I am wearing this because I am, as longtime listeners will know, kind of a circus obsessed aficionado, and that's why I'm particularly excited for our guest today. I have long followed his efforts. I've long followed his ministry. I actually got to speak to him once on a previous program that I used to host, but it was only a very, very brief conversation. So I'm excited for a much longer sit down today. He's the National Circus Chaplain, believe it or not, and the National Liaison to the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops on behalf of Circus. Please welcome to the Created Things podcast, Father Frank Cancro. How you doing, Father?
I'm good. It's good to be with you guys.
Hey, glad to have you.
So I gave you this kind of colorful spiel opener, the liaison, the chaplain. What does that mean? I think that would surprise most people to know that there even is a ministry to circus.
Sure. I think the easiest and best way to think about it is to simply think about a parish community, because in effect, the circus ministry is very much like a parish without roots, and a parish on wheels, if you will. We take care of the same pastoral needs that you'd find in any parish, the same spiritual care that would focus in any given community, except there are 48 different circus communities in the United States right now. And going to them is going to a variety of different experiences. But the educational stuff you'd find in a parish, the sacramental ministry that you would find there, the only unique stuff might be things like blessing tents. You don't do too many tent blessing. Most parishes are blessing equipment. But apart from that, this ministry has been meeting those same kind of parish needs, if you will, for the last 125 years here in the United States.
125 years? It's been around for that long.
Yeah. Circus is a little more than 200 years old in the U.S.
Okay.
And the church has had a response to it here for about 125. In Europe, for much longer than that, of course.
So you say the church has had a response to that. I mean, why is... I think most people don't even think about circus, period. I mean, that's kind of why we do this podcast, right? Most people don't actually think about the arts that often, certainly more obscure art forms that often, period, let alone thinking that a whole religion or a religious body would have a specific outreach to a specific art form like circus. I mean, it's just a lot of, not to make a circus pun, but it's like a lot of hoops for the mind to jump through. Talk to us about the foundations of this ministry, like why it was important for Catholics to do this, why it's still important to the church to do this, why do they care? I mean, it should go without saying maybe, but I'm sort of interested to figure out the origin story here and the mission behind it.
So the foundation is pretty logical when you think about it. The American circus didn't rely on a lot of its own folks when it came into existence in the 18th century. Many of the performers came from Western Europe and then eventually from South America, two areas that were very Catholic areas of the world. And so as they came to this country to perform, wanting a variety of their own needs meant anything from certain dietary focuses to asking questions about how can my spiritual needs be met as well. So there really was a focus from early on of providing for the majority of circus people who were Roman Catholics from various parts of Europe and, as I said later, from South and Central America. And that's still very much the case. A lot of circus performers still come from areas of the world that culturally and traditionally have been Catholic, so that at least a good 50% of circus performers still are Catholic. But the ministry has always kind of provided, not just for Catholics, but for everyone else on the shows as well. You know, the Catholic Church is the only denomination that has an organized, ongoing ministry to circuses. There aren't any competitors out there from other churches. And I would say that the owners of circuses would focus on our ministry far more than they would on anyone else trying to start a ministry, because we have such a record of being present and they're really to meet the needs of people and to walk with them on their individual journey. So that over a lot of years is what has kind of grounded the Catholic Church's position as kind of being the ministry focus for circuses, and at the same time being able to provide direct services to Catholics on the shows as well.
Right. Now, as somebody who knows, a lot less about circuses, the circus community, those experiences, than you or than Jacob, I think that it makes me think of other ways in which, the church and specifically is present to other forms of people on the move, right? So I was driving through Ireland one time with a Dominican friend of mine, and he was explaining to me about the Irish travelers, and then a lot about the way in which the church is present to the travelers and ministers to them and is with them, which is a whole fascinating thing. For Americans, somewhat more familiar and perhaps less exciting kind of mode. You think about I have a friend who has been a cruise ship chaplain. I mean, this is it's another form of people on the move, although less. Where of course your primary ministry is really to the people who are working on the ship, who are also mostly from Southeast Asia or South America or some places in Central and Eastern Europe that will have a stronger Catholic and then Orthodox community focus. But okay, so those are kind of one of those is a people, right? I mean, it's to be a traveler is to be a member of a very specific people, to be
like a cultural group.
Yeah, it's a specific cultural group, and to be on a cruise ship, either, below decks or above decks, so to speak, is to have an employment or a pastime. But obviously being a part of Circus is something very different. And it would strike me that the roles of the one who ministers in that community would therefore also be different. But I guess I would really appreciate whatever thoughts you have about, do you think it's fundamentally the same kind of thing, or do you think it's fundamentally a different kind of thing?
I think you can spin many of these different ministries. For instance, there's a traveler's ministry, by the way, here in the United States as well. And
I didn't know that.
The priest who is in charge of it functions out of South Carolina and takes care of the travelers that are here in the United States. Oh. There's also a carnival minister. There's a minister to rodeos, a minister to horse race track people. So we have a whole group of folks that are doing all of these on the move kinds of things. But I think the one thing we do all bear in common is we provide a ministry of presence. On the Ringling Brothers show a few years ago, there was I think it was the BBC was doing a series of interviews, and we happened to be on the show. Actually, two of us were there, which, when you see two black collars roaming around in the midst of glitter and rhinestones, you kind of wonder
what's going on here.
What's this all about? So they asked some questions to one of the clowns about who we were and what we did. And the particular clown they asked was not a church member. And in fact, I don't even think that the whole focus of faith was big in his own life. But the way he explained what we do was, which I thought extremely interesting, was it's like having your grandparents with you on the show. So it's that sense of creating, I didn't like the grandparent piece, but it's that sense of creating family, of having familiars, of someone who is grounded and can help ground you if you take it out of a religious context. So that ministry of presence, I guess is what I'm getting to, is really the thing that I think is held in common across the boards with all of these varied ways of reaching out to people on the move. It's a way to recognize the basic dignity that we share with them as human persons and as God's creatures, and provides that focus of presence for their particular needs.
So, I mean, first of all, that's beautiful just to think about that idea of a grounded person who can ground you and that ministry of presence. But I'm curious to hear about more your own background and how you became involved in that ministry of presence. Have you always worked with this ministry? Or is this like, do priests specifically become circus priests, or like, how does that work exactly?
So 50 years ago, maybe more than 50 years ago now, I was a clown. Oh, and so I had a connection with circus and that sort of life, but really only for a brief time. Only for about 2.5 years did I have a connection. I don't think I was particularly good, at what I did, but I knew the life and contributed to performance in that kind of way. And then I left it. I went on to other things and eventually to seminary and priesthood, and had pretty much put aside that whole past piece, I think. And in 2009, I was a pastor in North Carolina, and I was visited for the annual mission appeal collection that every parish takes up. We were assigned the circus ministry. And it was my first encounter, really, with the ministry. Although I knew it existed, I had not really had any contact with it. And I think I was assigned it because the priest in charge of our propagation of the faith office knew my background and figured, oh, this will work. Right. Frank will take care of them. So that's how it worked out. But anyway, a sister showed up, a missionary sister of the Sacred Heart, Sister Dorothy, who was traveling on the road full time in an RV with various shows, which is what the sisters did for many years. And so she showed up at the parish to, hawk a collection and take a second collection after all the masses. And between masses, I had her sit in my office so she could relax a little bit. Went in to see if she needed some coffee or something. And on my wall in my office was a portrait of me as a clown from long ago and far away. So, of course, as soon as I walk in, not remembering that was there, she points to it. I have a long history of nuns pointing their fingers that always get me in trouble, but
mysterious. Yeah, there's a way.
She pointed her finger at that picture and she said, I need to know who that is. And I said, well, that's me. And she says, well, then I need to know the story. So I told her that that was part of my background, that, actually the picture was from a magazine cover from years ago that my mother had gotten someone to kind of do a portrait with. But so I kept that. And so she didn't say anything more. But 2 weeks later in the mail, I received a letter from the USCCB inviting me to attend a meeting in just a few months in Sarasota, Florida. The ministry meets annually in Sarasota, and they invited me to the meeting because they figured I should be part of this. So that's really how I got into it in 2009. Was someone discovered I was an old clown, and that apparently was enough to invite me on board. But in discovering the others who were involved in the ministry, Father Jerry Hogan, who at the time was the head of the ministry at my job now, he had been doing this at that time for maybe about 18, 19 years. And he had been just a very avid circus fan as a youngster, and got to know one of the priests who was involved in the ministry way back then. And so when he became a priest, Father Fitz, and he kind of continued to be friends. And as he came down the road and as Fitz was getting ready to retire, Jerry's name got pushed to the front as someone who could step into, a role of knowing something about the shows and about circus and being able to provide ministry. So it's kind of along that line that one gets into the ministry. I'll be honest with you. I don't think just any priest can do it. It's a very different rhythm of life. In most parishes, people call and make appointments to come see Father. In the circus, Father has to wait and see when he can get an appointment with whoever based on their rehearsal schedule and, how many shows they're doing in a given day. And, the priest who's not, I think, very used to doing a lot of waiting in the parish world, a big part of my ministry is waiting to talk to people or to see people about various things. So it takes a certain personality, certainly, who's open to that and is very adaptable to this very changing lifestyle that the circus happens to be. But at the same time, a familiarity with what the shows are, and that way an ability to embrace people who might live a different rhythm than one finds in the pews of most parishes. I think those are at the core of what it takes to do this. And we've come from many very different ways. I have a priest who works with me, Father Dick Notter, who came into circus ministry because he was working with Latino migrants in the United States. And there are large groups of Latinos who end up doing, tent crew work and that sort of thing for some of the small traveling shows around the country. So that's how he got connected into the circus world and has continued to, to be mobile enough to do that. And he's in his 80s and he's still.
Oh my gosh. That's amazing. Yeah, that's amazing.
You mentioned Father Jerry and the sort of the legacy, I guess, of the different priests who've worked on this ministry is one of the reasons that we thought now would be a perfect time to invite you onto the podcast, because come the beginning of February, you guys are going to be celebrating a very momentous occasion, actually in Sarasota, which you also mentioned. Walk us through what's going to be happening.
So in the circus world, one of the things that sets circus performers apart, of course, is when the rest of your community recognizes what you've done. And that's articulated in what is called the Circus Ring of Fame. So it's a physical ring in St. Armand Circle in Sarasota. Sarasota, of course, was the heart of the Ringling Circus when it was flourishing. It was the winter quarters for that show, still is the winter quarters for a variety of other shows as well, big and small, that kind of work out of Sarasota or that area of Florida. So the Ring of Fame is kind of this ring that provides these huge plaques that commemorate the performance of special individuals in the world of the circus. And mostly it would be artists or occasionally groups of people because of their commitment to circus and circus community. Sometimes it's people who do the technical work in relationship to circus. But this year, for the very first time, someone in the circus ministry is being recognized as an important part of circus's history and being honored by having their plaque placed in the Ring of Fame on February 5th. And that's Father Jerry Hogan, who did this work for just over 28 years, was the National Circus Chaplain. And in a time of great upheaval and transition, really, circus in the United States has gone through significant change in the last 20 years, especially. And that's meant a lot of different things for different shows, but probably the biggest would be the fact that Ringling closed down and animals are starting to filter off of shows. And those are big, big changes in the circus world. And Jerry's been present through all of that, as well as the changing of the guard, the older guard in the circus world that has kind of given way now to a younger group of leaders. That wasn't always an easy transition to happen, but he was in the midst of all of that as it kind of unfolded. And so he became a key figure for a lot of people in circus. And so really was profound when he was first nominated and then elected to be honored by being put in the Ring of Fame this year. And we in the ministry, I guess vicariously, are also excited because we see it as a way to really say yes to something that has been the hard work of a lot of people for, as I said, 125 years. And now, in a sense, we're seen as part of the fabric and part of the family of circus. And that's a pretty significant thing. And the circus community is a community that doesn't accept you readily. You kind of have to prove yourself in order to get into the circus. There's a old circus yarn that no one talks to you for the first year. Well, in fact, that's true with some people. They don't. In fact, there's one guy I remember after a year when he finally started talking to me, I had to call Sister Dorothy on the phone and say, you won't believe it. You won't believe it. Alex started talking to me today. Oh my gosh. Because there's an acceptance there that happens when it's clear to them you're committed to this and you're staying. Otherwise, they're not going to waste time and energy and all of that, on you. So to be acclaimed as now a part of the fabric of circus, that's a real meaningful and significant thing, certainly for Jerry. But I think for all of us who are part of this ministry and have worked alongside him for many years.
Yeah, I can imagine. And it puts to mind. This might seem a little bit tangential, but it brings to mind to me actually, because you're thinking about this like itinerancy and motion and permanence. I mean, it's already a funny thing because, you led at the outset by saying that this is sort of like a parish without roots, and so, but even, and precisely within this sort of like rootless on the move thing, that the people want to make sure that you're staying in the rootlessness before they will talk with you, which was just marvelous and a beautiful thing. I found this little thing that you offered to, I think it was the parish that you were at when you were retiring, and you offered a few lessons that you had said that you thought were most important for you from your time in your priesthood. Exactly. And the second of them will be very familiar for I think a lot of Catholics, maybe all Catholics, and certainly as a priest, it resonated a lot with me. And you said that we're pilgrims on a journey, which is an automatic connection just for, Joseph Ratzinger wrote this book about the church as the pilgrim community, pilgrim fellowship of faith. There's this very strong emphasis on the church as a pilgrimage. Jacob and I here on the podcast have spent an episode talking about pilgrimage as an art form, as a way of living out prayer with our bodies and enacting art with our bodies, and the sort of cultural significance of all these kinds of things. I would love to get your thoughts on that, but before I actually let you give me your thoughts on that, I want to
the question before the question.
Yeah, exactly. I want to put this in like a slightly. I don't mean this in any kind of vexatious way, but I'm a medievalist, and so of course everything reminds me of something that happened in somewhere between the 7th and the 12th century, and so. The closest parallel that I can think of everything that you're saying that's actually beauty of Father Jerry's being recognized in this Hall of Fame, the critically important role of the ministry that you and the other priests involved in this, and religious and lay people who are involved in this ministry play, and all these things. To be totally frank, what it makes me think of is the Crusades. And I know they have a bad reputation. Let's just talk about the First Crusade.
But so does Circus.
Yeah, but so does the Circus. So just hear me out on this. Let's just stick with the First Crusade, because the rest are kind of a mixed bag. But the least mixed bag is the 1097 and 1099 one. And there is exactly this, like, where the whole like the major reason this is significant as a Catholic is not because, like, oh, we took Jerusalem, we're doing it, okay, whatever, that has historical things, but whatever. Like, the main thing is it helped really help people understand the art of being a layperson, you could say, because the way that they described, the way that the priests who were there wrote and described about it was exactly what you're saying. They say this is a parish on the move. At the time that parishes were not such a big thing, they talk about it as a religious order on the move, that these are lay people who are acting like a religious order on the move, and that the role of the priests, who get no respect, nobody cares about the priests, but they were central to this whole thing. They were, because they're there, they're with the people, they're sort of keeping them alive. The only person who seemed to have anything to do with keeping the First Crusade at all centrally organized was a priest, actually. And when he died, everything went into chaos. Anyway, so you get this. I guess I just want to put this in this sort of vexing or sort of intentionally troubling context, just because I think there's actually something really beautiful about this, the way that the church chooses to embrace, to be present in these kind of contradictory, difficult to understand, easy to reject, easy to misunderstand kind of situations, and yet in the middle of it you find this living art form, which is this parish on the move, which is life as a pilgrim journey. Okay, that's my very complicated. That was not a question. I'm not going to pretend it was, but I would love to hear your thoughts about pilgrimage,
sort of
whatever you want.
Plopping that out like a newborn baby giraffe.
Yeah, I'm not going to pretend
like
to put a question mark on the end of that. But I really do want to hear your thoughts.
So I think that one of the values of Circus is its portability, and I mean that from the perspective of the people involved in it. That here you have people who have been willing, in a sense, to let go of roots, and who live a life and find joy and gratification in that giving over of self. I mean, that's performances like that. I had a French priest explain it to me once as anéantissement, that kind of almost emptying out and giving over to, and finding your joy in doing that. Well, that's very much a pilgrim attitude, isn't it? That, I'm not attached to anything. I'm in the process of letting go completely, of giving myself over to what's next and what's next and what's next. And I think very much that is the psyche of the Circus. I think that people who are able to survive long-term 6-7 generations of families in Circus is because that's their orientation. They are on that kind of journey, and so the church becomes an opportunity to, in a sense, support the journey, to assist with the kinds of things that provide the strength to continue to let go. So the church makes a commitment to being portable as well, so that it can be passed around in the mix of these traveling communities, so that in doing what they do, they not only generate joy for who they serve, but for themselves. And I think that the presence of God is found in the midst of that very, very action. But it's not an attached action, and it has a lot to do with attitude, but it also has a lot to do with how you present yourself, the persona that you are on the circus. I don't know if you know this, but a lot of circus performers, as they're announced in the ring, the names that they're announced with are not their real names. Many of them have one of the most famous current trapeze acts is the Tunizianis. but there's not a Tuniziani in the Tuniziani troupe. There are mostly Garcias in the Tuniziani.
Awesome.
And Evans and Garcias in the Tuniziani troupe. But the person, what they create, the person that they create, that the name signifies, is part of the gift. It's really part of the whole ability to give over. And there's a certain dignity, I think, in constructing that and making that who it is you're going to be, not for you, but for others. Because on your bank account, it still says Steve Garcia, but who you are for others is this other person where, the mystique and the magic and the awe-inspiring actions, all that's all in that title, in that name, rather than just the everyday stuff. So it's the way you wrap up the gift and present it, as you kind of move along the way. I very much, the most popular hymn in circuses is the servant song, Will You Let Me Be Your Servant?
Yeah, sure.
But that second verse, we are pilgrims on a journey, we are travelers on the way.
Sure, right.
That gets belted out by Jews and Protestants and Catholics alike, because it's very much an identifier, I think, for people on the shows. I also think that commitment is what allows the art to flourish in a circus, allows people to push themselves to the next thing. Today or tonight in Monaco, the International Circus Festival, which is kind of the Emmys of the circus world, opens. And last time, which was 2020, was the last performance of it. Because of COVID, they didn't meet for 2 years. I was there because this trapeze troupe, the Tunizianis, were actually performing, and they ended up winning the Gold Clown, which is the highest award that's given at Monte Carlo. But it's the whole focus of trying to be the best in order to continue to perform. And Ahmed Garcia, who is the main flyer, his big feat was to accomplish 4 somersaults before being caught, which he was having a hard time doing when he worked on Ringling. But the very first show in Monaco, he hit it completely and did for every single performance after that. That sense of giving over in order to be the best that one can be, and how that energizes and gives life, back again. And isn't that the work of a pilgrim, to move on from respite to respite to get to the fullness of what it is that one is really doing, what one is really about.
I think that's beautiful to think about. And I'm also glad that you're pivoting us into kind of the artistic element of circus, because, you mentioned earlier the dignity of the human person, right? The shared dignity of the human person. Something that we often reflect on, Father Gabriel and I, is this idea that, beauty is a need, right? Like, people think of needs as being food and water and housing, and those are needs, but beauty is also a need. And this is a fundamentally Catholic conception that like, hey, people actually need beauty the same way they need food. And this is part of the reason I have always resonated with circus so much, is because of the portability you're talking about. Not only on the side of the performers is there this remarkable portability, but also, I grew up in an extremely small town. The movie theater had 2 screens, right? You had to drive an hour or more to go to anything even resembling a playhouse, but circus would come through. And it was almost like this ministry of art where you could see people from all over the world, and you could see animals from all over the world. And I'd like to actually talk about the animal thing at some point, because I'm personally very pro, circus animal and things. But just on the beauty front, this idea of a ministry of art to people outside the circus who wouldn't get to see this art normally. I'm curious to hear you kind of comment on that. And also to hear you comment just kind of on art forms that you've been exposed to that you wouldn't expect, right? Because I think when you ask the average person in the street, what are the arts, they're going to think like painting and singing. Maybe they're not going to think driving around inside a motorcycle cage, right? But these are art forms that you've gotten quite literally a front row seat to. How has that impacted you? How have you seen that impact the kind of people that this ministry is for, so to speak?
It's a real profound lesson in understanding. I can't think of any other word than grace, the grace of a person, as well as the grace which is that encounter with the presence of God, and the real art that comes with knowing how to use your body and knowing the importance of timing. And so again, I don't want to seem fixated on trapeze people because I have a lot of other friends doing a lot of other things. But I learned a profound lesson from a trapeze artist from Morocco, who we were talking one day just about what he does. And, I think I was just gawking at the amazing way they were doing what they did. And he looked at me and says, the real challenge of the trapeze is not swinging on the bars or climbing up the ladders. He says, the real challenge of trapeze is what happens between the bars. Because it's all about timing. It's about what you get accomplished and get caught. That's the real art of it, that it really has to do with how you're controlling your body, what you're allowing people to see and do, and doing it in such a way that it comes to completion and is awe-inspiring. So I really have learned that sense of the physicality of art, if you will, that the circus certainly, focuses on. I remember one time there were a group of clowns doing what's called a slide table. You know what a slide table is?
I don't. Please explain it.
A slide table is usually a long aluminum table that you literally slide on. And because of the composition of the table and the composition of the costume you're wearing, it's easy to be able to kind of approach it from one end and slip 10 feet down and out the other end. And in the midst of sliding, of course, you can do some acrobatics and other kinds of things. And it's used a lot with comic physical work, and that clowns especially would do. But I remember being at a show and I was sitting in the audience, which I don't do a whole lot, but I happened to be sitting in the audience to watch this show because I like a good slide table. And I was watching this happen, and there was this little girl with her, I guess her grandmother, next to me. And when the slide table, which was really funny and very well done, but when it was over, she turned to her grandmother and she said, "Wasn't that beautiful?" And that's the word that caught me, is the clowns weren't going for beauty. Well, they were, but that wouldn't be the word they would use to describe what they were going for, nor was it certainly what I was thinking of in relationship to something that is a comic presentation. But to this young girl, what she saw was beauty being manifested in a sense of timing and performance, and that eye-widening kind of ability to keep one drawn to what it is that's happening on that simple little aluminum table.
That's stupendous. That's stupendous. I do a lot of writing and thinking about beauty and the nature of beauty and all of this. That's one of those examples you kind of want to treasure, because that's just exactly right. That's just exactly right. That's the right response. Like, I think it's C.S. Lewis. I think it's in The Abolition of Man. He talks about being at some. It's not the Grand Canyon because he's in England somewhere, but some impressive natural wonder, and he hears like two different couples passing by, and one of them says, "Isn't that sublime?" And the other couple says, "Isn't that pretty?" And he says, the one is wrong and the other is right. That, like, in fact, what it isn't is pretty, but in fact, what it is sublime. He's making a kind of technical distinction that is, I think, nonetheless helpful. But here you see something really splendid, which is just that, however old this little girl is, she's probably just reaching for the highest level of praise that she's heard people
Her best word
offer,
yeah.
and it's her best word, which is that there's things that are pretty, and there's things that are nice, and there's things that are cute, and things that are sweet. But this is something. There's just something has happened that has exceeded all of these thresholds.
Exactly.
And the only word, whatever her age was, the only word she has for it is that this is beautiful.
Beautiful.
That's marvelous. That's absolutely marvelous.
Father Gabriel has
that's
taken
the energy
this.
that
Go ahead.
circuses travel on.
Yeah, I believe it.
That's the energy that circuses travel on.
I love that. You could put that on a T-shirt. That circus, the energy circuses travel on is beauty. Father Gabriel has now taken us down a couple of his rabbit holes of his personal interests, with the Crusades being the particularly weird one. But I want to do so with one of mine. So I'm a student of, and we have a lot of non-Catholic listeners here too. So I always try to kind of pull a Dora the Explorer and define some of my language as I'm talking. But I'm a big student of Pope St. John Paul II's theology of the body, which is, roughly speaking, reductionistically speaking, this document, this series of speeches that the late Pope St. John Paul II gave on human sexuality and our capacity for love and the goodness ultimately of the body and God's design, right? And you touched on that, and I want to explore that more with you whenever we started talking about this whole art thing and the sort of, I think you even said like the mastery of the body, the way people are using their bodies this way. And, as three devoutly Catholic people on here who happen to be all on different parts of the art world, like I think we can take for granted that the church has this deep appreciation for beauty and the human body. But of course that's not the stereotype of the church any more than it is the stereotype of the circus. You are surprisingly, probably to most people outside of either the circus world or the Catholic world, you are this priest, as you said, in a black collar among the sequins and the rhinestones, and you are giving confession to guys in full clown makeup, and you are giving Eucharist to girls in extremely skimpy like rhinestone outfits and all these things. And I think I would imagine you have this fundamentally more intimate, more nuanced perspective of the human body and its capacity for beauty than maybe the average parish priest would. Would you mind kind of enlightening us on your own thoughts there and how maybe your posture with that has been expanded in your role as circus chaplain?
Sure. First, let me say something about the skimpy outfits, because they're actually they're not skimpy. If you would look up close, you can't see this from a seat, but everything that appears to be a bare skin is not. It's actually a fabric.
Oh, sure.
So
sure.
The trapeze artists and everyone who's exposed except for genitals and that sort of thing, there's fabric everywhere, and often from the neck all the way down. The principle that Lyotard, the French guy who kind of invented a lot of the stuff that people wear in circuses now, that one of his things was that the body had to be protected at the same time that clothing had to be extremely flexible. So that's how all of this sort of came about. So I see that up close, that in fact there is a regard for the dignity of the person, even though what it appears to be a lot more skin. It's really fabric that's colored to the individual that's wearing it, and is really making available the best for the type of performance that an individual is undertaking. But that said, I've really come to appreciate, and actually I think there's a little bit of an indictment here. I came to appreciate how much people do respect their bodies and care for them, because they are, in a very real way, what is necessary for their livelihood, but also it's a vehicle for their own personal joy and the joy that they give to others. Circus performers love what they do, or they wouldn't be doing it. And so in order to do what they do, they care for their body is really a very important thing. And so even things like the nutrition they follow, how they work out in their dressing rooms, how they care for themselves when they have time off, the what I would have considered, growing up in Philly, pampering would be anything that wasn't just a shower and shampoo. But
That's right. That's right.
but the time that people take to care for their skin, to even, I guess, do spa and other sorts of mani-pedi experiences, all of that stuff is, for them, is all seen as a way to really care for this instrument that is the vehicle for them to do what they do for themselves and for others. So, my kind of roly-poly self is indicted often when I see the amount of care that they take in relationship to what I've kind of, gone through as I've moved through my life to deal with its reality. So I think I really do appreciate there's this innate sense, maybe part of survival, that this is a gift and an instrument that I need to care for, and that there is a commitment on the part of folks to do that. I've even seen it with parents on shows with the way they are teaching their children about nutrition and about exercise and those sorts of things. I see that kind of passed down, backstage, that's an important element because it allows us to be who we are and to do what it is that we do. And conversely, I'll say there's also a commitment sometimes to do the hard stuff. So one of the things you may not know is that arthritis is a pretty common disease for old clowns.
Oh, sure. Yeah, sure.
And part of the reason for that is the physicality of what it is that they do. And they know that going into the business, although they certainly do their best falls and, physically deal with things the best way that they can. But over time, of course, if they choose to stay committed to the profession, it's going to have an effect on them physically too. And I know some of the older clowns who planned for that, planned for what I'm going to have to do when I know this is going to happen, or that this is going to certainly be something I face as I move down the road, or that they've moved into other aspects of circus work because things were starting to shift and change as they aged a bit. But all of that was because they were perceptive to what it was that was happening to them or would happen to them. And as part of their commitment, we're willing to go with that nonetheless.
That's fascinating. Yeah. There's this very, very, very famous, very broadly told story that, let me just tell a quick version of it. So it's generally known in English as Our Lady's Tumbler, or the Jongleur of Notre Dame. And the story goes that you have a tumbler. So it's one of the first written versions we have is this medieval French poem, but so take it where you will. It's handed down a lot of versions, but so it's a tumbler who's been a part of essentially like a 12th, 13th century circus, who's been living this life, and he gets disillusioned with the emptiness of the life on the road and all of its ardors as the story that goes and everything, the emptiness of the life of worldly success and show. And there's an implicit indictment of the luxuria, the voluptuousness of the way of life, which is proposed as specifically bad. So he leaves the circus and joins a monastery, and discovers in the monastery that he can't do anything that he's supposed to do. So he can't really read, he can't pray, he can't say the hours of the office like he's supposed to. He doesn't know what to do in mass and all the rest. And so he's in despair and doesn't know if he should just leave the monastery. But if he leaves the monastery, he thinks he'll be going back to the world in the strict and moral sense, and he doesn't want to do that. So he comes to his own resolution of things, which is that he finds a sort of crypt chapel for Our Lady. And when everyone else is in chapel praying the Psalms, he goes to the basement chapel, and he takes off his robe, and he's just in a loincloth basically, and he tumbles before Our Lady's altar, and tumbles until he passes out basically, and then resumes his life. this goes on for a while. The other monks begin to be suspicious. Why is he always away at prayer? And they think he's back to his luxurious, voluptuous ways as a corrupt circus performer. And so they track him down and they see what he does.
I hate those voluptuous
luxurious,
ways,
voluptuous ways that all tumblers have. And they spy him out and they see what he's doing, and they're horrified because they think that he's just he's mocking the Virgin Mary. And then, shock of all shocks, there's an apparition of the Virgin Mary in which he says that this is my loyal servant. He is offering the finest gift. He's offering the finest gift that was given to me today, rather than what the monks are doing above. Eventually, he dies, and these angels appear, and they take his whole. These demons are trying to snatch his soul and pull him into hell, but these angels appear and they pull him up because the Virgin Mary has received his gift as a perfect offering. This story has been told, literally thousands of different ways. It's been passed down in different.
It's an old, rich folk tale.
It's very old. It's very rich. It goes through all kinds of places. There's a contemporary medievalist and Latinist who's written, named Jan Ziolkowski, who has written, I promise you, no fewer than 6 volumes about this story. He has written a 6-volume study of this story called The Juggler of Notre Dame and the Medievalizing of Modernity, which is, the next time you have time to read a 6-volume study of a 2-page story, you should do it. It's amazing. I have a lot of thoughts about this story and what's beautiful about it, what's strange about it. I'm curious because it's such an obvious and immediate connection. Let me just ask first, simply put, is this a story that's known to you? Is this part of your reflection? Do you think it's an interesting story? Do you think it's an unhelpful story? What's your kind of? Do you think it's just a cliche? You don't really care about it?
No, I think it's a good story, and again, from my perspective, I understand his struggle and what it leads them to. Time and time again, I know performers that, they do what they do. They're driven because it's the gift that God has given to them. They will say consistently that they sometimes feel the closest to God when they're doing their craft, whether it's on a wire or a trapeze or whether they're
or a sliding table
or a slide table. That there's a real that's where they have that intimate connection because they're doing what they're able to do best. They may not have a lot of words for things, or they may not come from a tradition where there's a lot of a rote prayer, or to be honest, in the circus, we don't have a real tradition of Eucharist. We do it when we can.
I see, sure, yeah.
Not on a weekly basis, not, so even religious practice is not as regular as one would find in other venues. There's only a few of us, and we've got 48 shows to get around to. So, it's not always an easy challenge. So the most consistent focus for them is that encounter that they have through what it is that they know they can do and do well, that best expresses them, and that they see that as a way to intimately connect to the presence of God. You'll see performers when they go out to go up on a ladder or into the globe of death with their motorcycle, that they'll always start with a sign of the cross. And that's not, I think I thought at one point, it's just a cultural kind of thing, but it really isn't, because I've talked to them about that very thing, and there's a very precise ritual that many of them will go through that engage them with the presence of God in that moment, because they think that's an important element of what and how they're able, really to perform. So that story does really, I think, have some resonance in the way that that circus folks especially, kind of encounter that. In the ministry, one of the things, our meetings are normally the first week in January, but we're meeting in February because of Father Jerry's induction. But St. Martha's Church in Sarasota, I don't know if you know this, is the National Circus Church. It's where all of our records are kept. It's where I'm technically on the staff there.
Nice.
And even though I'm a priest of Charlotte, I have faculties in the Diocese of Venice because of St. Martha's and its connection to the circus world. The church was built by people who worked for Ringling Brothers, and built on property that was owned by the Ringling Brothers Circus for a lot of years. And the very first chaplain happened to be the priest who was assigned to that little mission on Orange Avenue in Sarasota. Was the very first circus chaplain. But one of the things we're talking about when we get together the first week in February is, with the bishop's current move about a refocusing on the Eucharist, what does that mean for us who work with a community that isn't as Eucharistic as many parishes are? How can you be Eucharistic without a consistent presence of the Eucharist is really, I think, the question we're going at. And this little parable, this story, I think gives a little insight into how we connect to the presence of God when that sacramental presence isn't always the reality that we can, have. So I think this is a very valuable story and creates an image of something that I think is very important to performers.
The conversation right now is sort of drawing my mind to this juxtaposition that is so viscerally felt for any artist of faith between what I think, I have problems with this phrase, but what's stereotypically called like the sacred and the profane, right? And I have a big fan of different kind of more obscure art forms, as I've mentioned. And one of the ones that I within the last few years have started kind of looking at is retablos, which are sort of, they can be snobbishly and somewhat problematically described as like folk art icons, right? And they're these sort of often on wood, these folk art paintings of personal miracles, these things that you have had a personal encounter with the divine and you want to celebrate or commemorate that in some spiritual capacity. And while these are seen all over the Latin American world, a surprising percentage of them have to do with circus miracles specifically, like a huge percentage. And they really feature this idea that we're talking about. And for any, if there are any kids listening to this episode, you should probably skip ahead just like 5 minutes because
watch out for the
lot of them are right. Cause a lot of them can get pretty intense. And my favorite one is, and this is like weirdly not an uncommon motif, but this guy, he's a clown, I think in Mexico, and he's thanking St. Anthony of Padua specifically for his intercession because he's a clown in the ring and there was a dancing horse that got an absolutely extreme erection and tried to force itself on the clown. And he thanked St. Anthony for rescuing him from this horse and specifically from rescuing the children from seeing such a terrible thing. And you see like a lot of these, like I think his name was literally like Big Booty the Clown. And it like the caption was Big Booty the Clown thanks St. Anthony of Padua for his miracle. And like that seems so silly, but then when you get past the immediate silliness of it, there's just something so, it's like that little girl saying that the slide table was beautiful, right? It is this beautiful crashing together of the sacred and the profane that I think a lot of artists of faith have some tactile experience of, but that must just be, I would imagine, super extreme and super visceral for a lot of circus artists specifically.
So in 2017, I think it was, in Providence, Rhode Island, on the Ringling Brothers Circus, there was an accident with 8 women who performed in a hair hang act. So they hung by their hair and they twirled and did minor acrobatics, and they did it 40 feet in the air. And a faulty pin of some sort led that to crash to the ground, and they were badly injured in that accident, and their rehabilitation was really took a long time, and 5 of them were told they never walk again. They began a real focus of prayer to Our Lady of Guadalupe in particular. That became a real focus in this, visiting them in the hospital and later on in rehab centers. The Guadalupe image was important to them. Praying to her was important to them. groups would gather for rosaries. We had people on one of the shows who didn't even know what the heck a rosary was, who was saying the rosary with these people because this was such an important focus for them. A year later, they're all walking. I mean, not one of them is what the doctors said would be. And of that group, 3 of them are back on shows.
Oh my gosh!
And 2 of them are doing hair hang stuff again.
Oh my gosh!
In other venues, they've gone on to have families and the like. So yes, I think there is a real intensity to, in this pilgrimage, who you're walking with. And I think circus performers readily see themselves walking closely with God. And so
it's such, all the art forms are so close to death, right? Like that's what's really hitting me as you say this, like whether you're hanging from your hair or whether you're working with a tiger. And if I remember correctly, you have a very particular sacramental story having to do, I think, with a tiger.
Father Jerry has a sacramental story about the tiger.
Oh, was that
Confessions with the tiger breathing down his neck? Is that the?
Yeah. I think that's what I'm thinking of. Yeah, but I mean, you're so close to death at all times, right? And that's got to give you this really interesting and intimate relationship with the divine.
And interesting to me is that knowing that people do death-defying things, there's still a yes to doing it.
Sure.
There's a young man who's performing in Monaco for the exposition over there right now, the competition, who's from the U.S. He does unicycle work, but he does extremely tall unicycle work. And he was on a unicycle in Spain last year and fell off of a 26-foot unicycle. He broke bones in both of his legs, and he was in rehab in Spain for months. And young guy, and so he went and did work with dogs for a while. I guess he thinking he'd get back into the circus world, but he worked with dogs, and that just wasn't satisfying. So he's back up on the unicycles, and in fact, he has I want to say it's 28 or 29 feet. He just broke the record for height on the unicycle. And he's back at that again. And all of that I think is tied to that very thing that I'm willing to yield to that this is part of the journey too. That's part of what makes circus. I think is that there's always that tantalizing focus of what is death defying, and that you have people who are willing to say yes to that.
Yeah. No, it's, your experience obviously is somebody who's coming at this one from internal understanding from beforehand, and then has been able to have this really beautiful vision of it. And personally, I find it really remarkable and exciting to know that that church has been present to this in its beauty and its strangeness for so long in the States, which is exciting and really marvelous. But something that does catch my attention about this beautiful story of the tumbler of Notre Dame, Our Lady's tumbler, is that there does remain actually a lot of suspicion about the tumbler that never goes away, right? Even it's prima facie to be understood that the monks are right to be suspicious that he will have gone back to his life of luxuria. And they turn out to have been wrong, but it's totally reasonable and believable that they would have thought that. And even that kind of detail at the end that even though Our Lady has already said that this is the most acceptable sacrifice that she's been given, in fact, there remain these demons that are pulling his soul into hell, that she has to send special graces, so that angels will pull him to heaven kind of at the last minute. I just find that really striking, that even from a sympathetic and a loving and a clearly accepting, this folk tale commentary on circus life is in from a very positive perspective, and this very positive sense of the worship of the body, worship through the body and the art of the body and all these things, and yet there remains this suspicion, and yet there remains this distance. From your own experience, again, I think of very clearly having been able to either push through that or not experiencing it yourself, or kind of circumvent it one way or the other. I don't know. Do you have thoughts or suggestions or insights? I mean, I just think like a lot of people come to, if not necessarily circus, like things that are so physically involved with a certain amount of resistance, like, oh, sure, I get it. But at the same time, it's still very like, oh, it's death defying, but it's also very bad for you. Or maybe it's really secretly though bad for you. I don't know. Like that secret voice in the background that says like, yeah, but the devils are still waiting to pull this guy into hell. Like, I don't know. What's your thoughts? Like, how do you get behind that or get over it?
There is very much, I think, that carny experience. Carny's not a term that circus people would use, but the cultural world tends to have this sense that a person who's in that kind of traveling show position is a shady character, and maybe someone ought to be trusted, and not quite sure what's really true and not true about them. And circus people certainly suffer from that being the case. In fact, I think it's one of the things that builds strong community within the circus.
Oh, sure.
Is the fact that sometimes there's a misunderstanding of them outside of the circus. I was at a big tented show, and I wanted to watch the show. Remember, I said I rarely do that, but I wanted to watch it because they made some major changes. I wanted to see how it was working in the ring. So, of course, they gave me a seat like in their VIP section, right down in the very first row. So I go out to sit in my seat, and they have a pre-show ahead of time. So that meant that people come and mingle in the ring areas because there are little things going on they can engage in, and then they come back to their seats. There was a woman who came back behind me in the next row behind me. And, of course, I'm sitting there in a collar. I'm wearing a big ID for the show that says Circus Chaplain on it. And her husband and I guess their grandchild were still out in the ring. And where we were sitting, there was some contraption that was put up for the pre-show that she started complaining about because she thought it was going to interfere with her view during the show. So I turned around and I said, oh, man, you've got the best seats in the house. You're going to be fine for being able to see everything. And then as her husband and grandchild are coming back over, I hear this tumbling and then a thunk behind me. And what had happened was her purse had fallen down between the chairs and under the ledge of the ramp and was down on the ground. And she tapped me on the shoulder and she said, well, could you get my purse for me? And I said, well, I can't, but let me get someone who works the arena area, and they would be able to go underneath and get that for you. And she looked at me up and down when I said no, but I would get somebody. And she said to me, well, what exactly do you do here? Well, I mean, I'm wearing this big collar and I got this big hunkin' ID on. I said, well, I'm the circus chaplain. And without missing a beat or blinking an eye, she looked at me and she said, why do people like this need someone like you?
Whoa.
Oh, geez.
Well, that's an attitude. And I was very proud of the fact that I didn't haul off and hit her or didn't say anything nasty back to her. But the fact is that's an attitude that's out there, and an attitude that certainly gets communicated to folks on the road. I honestly think that some of the animal stuff is really tied to that, because let's be honest, you can't make a 7,000-pound elephant do anything it doesn't want to do.
Right. This is what I'm always arguing when people do the whole, like, oh, it's wrong to have animals in circus and stuff.
Plus, I have free access anywhere on the lot unannounced. And I have always only seen caring people who for whom the animals are their family as much as anything else. But I think that some of the rhetoric about all of that is tied to that same thing, that mistrust, that well, this is a circus. These are shady people.
Fascinating.
So I do think that that's very much still there. And I think it's the fact that we don't deal well with difference in our culture. It's the same thing that feeds our racism and so many other aspects of our own insecurities. And of course, I think it's born out of fear, but that's probably a whole different show to talk about that.
I mean, honestly, on the insecurity level, I think this is to sort of give a quick version of my sort of testimony, right? Like I think this is why I resonate with circus so much as a collective art form, because, so I was raised on what might be kind of considered, to use outsider language, like the ministry or the missionary circuit, right? So I was always traveling with my parents in a car to different talks, and, the family would pile out of the car. We set up the booth and the kids sell the books while the parents talk, and, everybody does everything. And, I grew up like picked on for being Catholic and for having a faith. And, I still grimace. I have very close friends who are not Catholic, but who respect my faith, I'll meet at different networking events for my art. And they'll say, oh, like Jacob has this Catholic podcast, and I'll just grimace because I know that everybody's eyes are going to, just shut down as soon as that's said. And I think I've always sort of seen circus almost as a metaphor for what it felt like to be Catholic, both good and bad, right? And that there is a shadiness to it, but if we're being honest, but like there is this radical familialness, and there is this distrust from everyone else that hurts, but that also brings you closer to why you're there. And there is this perpetual being on the road, and like you even said, like constantly sacrificing a desire for the illusion of roots, in favor of this constant pilgrimage. And even, I mean, touching on the animal thing, right? Like these are people who, this guy's great granddad trained this tiger's great granddad, and they've been in the family this whole time. And this sort of almost Genesis-esque connection with nature. And it always felt like circus was an analogy for my faith, and my faith was kind of an analogy for what it felt like to be, what I imagined it would be to be in circus. And I constantly, every time I go, I mean, I live in Orlando personally, so I'm able to drive up to Sarasota and visit St. Martha's and go to the Show People Circus and Loomis Brothers and all these kinds of things. And it constantly, it's almost like reading a book. It's almost like reading that Tumblr story that Father Gabriel's mentioning, because it constantly brings new insights into my faith every time I experience that art form. And I think ultimately that's what art is all about, right? To sort of inspire that spiritual transcendence on some level. That's my experience anyway. But I see, pivoting off or jumping off of that distrust thing that you guys are talking about of just circus people. I feel that that's a very visceral aspect of the Catholic experience too. And it does constantly surprise me how much shared space there is in the Venn diagram.
Yeah, I think that's
I think cool. For me, the other thing that I find fascinating is, so circuses nowadays, a lot of very young people, a lot of people who certainly have a different attitude sometimes about the Catholic Church, Catholic priests. We live in communities where sadly sometimes there's just automatic mistrust of that whole thing. And I have to be very honest that I've always been amazed that in the circus, there's always complete and utter acceptance. You're always one of the family. You're brought right in. I just contacted a new person in a circus that's on the West Coast that I plan to be with in March, and just said, "Hey, it's me, and I'm coming this week, and I haven't met you yet, but I'm anxious to just get to see you all," and blah blah blah. And just the response is, welcome in. We can't wait to have you come out. And and other shows that this is the season of shows cranking up. Loomis Brothers, in fact, has just opened in Florida, and a lot of the Florida shows are starting to crank around. Circus Sarasota is going to open in 2 weeks, and so that's all beginning to happen. So I'm getting these calls or notes from people: "When are you coming? We need to have you for our opening," or there's a new circus called Circus Omnium, which deals primarily with people with disabilities, both in the audience, but also as performers. It's an amazing concept. And it's opening in the end of February up in the DC area. And Lisa, who's a general manager and a Jew, called me and said, we need you. We need you for the opening weekend. You're coming up. Can you be with us? We can't imagine opening without you.
Oh my gosh.
There's this total acceptance of who we are to the circus community in a world where that's not always the case. Dare I say, even in our own parishes, sometimes it's not the case. But I am always amazed by that reality of that invitation in, and that acceptance of who we are. Maybe because these are people who have experienced something similar, just in terms of their own journey.
On that note of journey, I would love to talk to you for another 2 hours, but it's like 3 a.m. or something your time, Father Gabriel, and we all have things to do. So I want to wrap this up with getting your insights on this, Father Frank. So as I've said, this is a podcast. This is like Zoom. This is like artsy Zoom, right? It's art for a show by artists for artists, right? And I always want to give creative people listening to this something to think about, something to bring into their own art, and I think you as a pastor specifically to these kinds of artists who are dealing with this struggle of not having roots, of leaving behind that safety, people who live that close to death, people who live with this sense of being misunderstood, people who give their whole bodies for their art. Like you must have people all the time coming to you for spiritual advice on their personal artistic struggles. And I'm just wondering what kind of parting thoughts you'd have for any creatives listening on what they can sort of draw from your own experiences that they could apply to their own artistic and spiritual journeys and those struggles that we all have in common.
So I would say that when I look at circus arts, they're the creative kind of arts that kind of blend, physicality and emotion together. I think maybe in a unique way. Maybe others in the art world fair. Would have a different way of looking at it, but I find that can only happen. That blend of the physical and the emotional can only happen when there is the ability to be able to know yourself well enough for when it's time to step back, to re-energize, for the believer maybe to engage in the kind of prayer that is life-giving and revives. That there cannot be a constant giving on this journey. There always has to be those times where you fall back into the arms of other pilgrims and maybe let them help you along the way a little bit. And I think that's definitely true for circus people. And I would say maybe anyone involved in the arts has to look at that possibility. What rhythms do they create that allow them to be able to do that step back while stepping forward and have the time to regenerate and find new life for themselves? Otherwise, I think that really can affect one's ability to be creative, in any way. Is if you're letting that well kind of run dry. And part of what I think fills the well is not just good friends and good wine and good conversation, but I think it's sometimes good prayer and good personal reflection. And the other thing, this is more, I think, something that I see in doing my ministry, and that is, I always have to be open to stimulating my own sense of imagination and creativity. Because then I think I stay aware of how I can best communicate with and be in step with those people that I serve, in the circus. So for me to even think about how do I do that? How does that kind of work itself out in my own life? It's a way for me to be available, I think. So if you're walking along with someone else, I think to recognize that I think you have an obligation to make sure that you're doing something about feeding your imagination and supporting your creativity, whatever it is, in order to make that available to those that you journey with who might also be creative as well. Those two things kind of come to my mind.
Thank you so much. I love both those things. I will personally take those into my own prayer and consideration, and I'm sure that they will be inspirational for many people listening. Before we let you go, let us know where we can find out more about you and what you're doing. Where can people support the Circus ministry? How can people better support this, circus creatives, in their area,
Sure.
perhaps, or anything? How do people help out?
So our website is circusministry.com, and there's contact information there for myself as well as others that are involved in the ministry, and just some brief focuses for what it is that we do and where we do it. We also, if you would look up Show People's Winter Quarters, Show People's Winter Quarters. We run a retirement center for people who come off the road. It's to bring their RVs if they don't have the money. We give them a sliding scale place to stay and live out their years. And so we have this in Seffner, Florida. And Show People's Winter Quarters is always looking for people to support it. And if you Google that, you'll come up with both their website and their Facebook page. And there are opportunities there to look at what we do with our ministry to kind of support people off the road as well as those that are on the road. So those would be the two things. Or look me up. If you go to a circus, ask if the priest is there, and they'll go get me if I'm around, and we'll say hello. That's always a good thing to do.
Go to the circus and let this idea of sacrificing for your art and being on that journey permeate everything you do. And with that said, as we always wish, go forth and create cool things.
This has been Created Things, a production of Art, Soul, and Mind, hosted by Jacob Flores Popchek and Father Gabriel Toretta, produced by Kyle Meineke and Jessica Flores Popchek. Theme song by Federico Carranza. For more on this podcast and the artists featured, follow us on Instagram at Created Things Podcast, and subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, and wherever fine podcasts are streamed.